Welcome back. We have finally arrived at Revelation chapter 13, the one chapter in the whole book that deals specifically with the short-term reign of the Antichrist. Today we cover the first half of chapter 13 from verses 1 through 10.
And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints, and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If any man have an ear, let him hear. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints.
The first part of verse 1 says, Then I stood on the sand of the sea, although the Greek text actually has this phrase as the closing of chapter 12, rather than the beginning of chapter 13. Some translations therefore render this as the dragon stood on the shore of the sea. Either way, we do see the beast rising up out of the sea, and then in verse 1 the dragon gives him his authority. The beast is described as having 7 heads and 10 horns, like a leopard with feet like a bear's and a mouth like a lion's. This beast is reminiscent of the creatures Daniel saw in his vision in Daniel chapter 7. This symbolism is explained to John later in chapter 17, but in summary, the beast itself represents both a world dictator that we call the Antichrist, although the word Antichrist isn't even used in Revelation, as well as the empire or demonic world system, where the various heads have been the empires throughout history in opposition to his people. And the horns represent the kings or leaders in this final world kingdom. The head, which seems to have had a mortal wound but then is healed, suggests a revival of one of these empires. Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2, which describes the feet of the statue having some of the same characteristics as the legs of iron but mixed with clay, gives us a sense that this revived empire will be an end times reincarnation of the Roman Empire, but less cohesive and with a tenfold division. As for the 10 horns, they are 10 kings during the final empire. Several decades ago, prophecy scholars and authors such as Hal Lindsey used to keep a special eye on the European Union as being a revived Roman Empire made up of 10 nations. But now that seems to have moved beyond that, and we may be looking at more of a global government divided into 10 sovereign nations or regions. The imagery of the beast having a mortal wound that was healed may also be specific to the individual world leader who becomes the head of this final empire. He may actually appear to die and be resurrected as a form of counterfeit miracle that would cause all in the world to follow after him and worship him as Messiah, all those who don't know the true Messiah. We will learn more about this specifically in the next lesson when we cover the remainder of chapter 13. In verses 5 through 6, we're told that the beast speaks haughty and blasphemous words, and that he was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. Once again, the period of 3.5 years is mentioned, and this seems to correlate to the latter half of the 7-year period that Revelation covers. During the first 3.5 years, the 2 prophets prophesied in Jerusalem, and then when this beast rises, he kills the prophets, they are caught up into heaven. Then the Antichrist persecutes the saints and exercises his reign of terror during the latter 3.5 years, while the woman from chapter 12 is secluded in the wilderness. This is all 7th trumpet stuff. The campaign of Armageddon occurs during this time, and the final bowls of wrath. Verse 10 has a statement that varies a bit in meaning depending on which translation you're reading. Some translations say, He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Others interpret it thus: if anyone is to go into captivity, he will go into captivity. If anyone is to be killed with a sword, he must be killed. Here is the endurance and faith of the saints. The first obviously seems to be a law of natural consequences. As you sow, so shall you reap. If you kill with the sword, you will be killed with the sword. The second way is simply stating that we must be patient, because whatever we're meant to suffer, we will suffer. The second meaning is already an inherent part of the walk we're called to as Christians, so there really isn't much to be said about this or any specific application other than stay the course. But as for the first version, I think there's a good application we can learn from it in today's society, and that is, what happens when believers try to take things into their own hand and rise up against the governing authorities. Let's take a moment to reflect back to the first century about the Zealots, and ask ourselves, how have today's believers become the new Zealots? There has lately been a confused intertwining between modern mainstream evangelical Christians with far-right wing conservatives. Some overlap is fine and we share some common values and goals, but sometimes very different approaches. Yeshua and his disciples wholeheartedly agreed with the Zealots that the Jewish nation was really established by God, and really have no king except our Father in heaven, no law except God's law. Where they differed significantly from the Zealots was how to deal with the current government. Rome in their case, our local state and federal governments in our case. During the COVID-19 pandemic, so many of my Christian friends were even circulating memes, putting down those of us who comply with the government, obey social distancing and mask rules and so forth, depicting us as sheep, like that's supposed to be bad. They identified themselves as the wolves, the good guys, the freedom fighters, those that will resist rather than pry my AR-15 out of my cold dead fingers and so forth. Well, that's exactly how the Zealots were. When Yeshua taught about if someone asks you to go 1 mile, go with him 2, he was specifically teaching diametrically opposite their views. This really threw the Zealots for a loop. And who was the real hero, Barabbas or Yeshua? These confused Christians would follow Barabbas, whereas we're exhorted to obey governing authorities, such as in Romans 13, 1-7, and 1 Timothy 2, 1-2. A friend who leads a congregation on the East Coast shared with me recently his perspectives on Barabbas versus Yeshua, and gave me permission to quote him here. He says, "My thoughts on Barabbas is this. Barabbas was the political revolutionary who promised freedom from Rome through force and fight. When our people were asked to choose between Barabbas and Yeshua, they were being asked by God, who do you want? Do you want the political revolutionary or the Prince of Peace? It's time to choose. Our people chose the revolutionary. That's the lesson of the Yeshua versus Barabbas narrative. They chose freedom through force, not freedom from sin. I believe that this choice unleashed the anti-establishment Antichrist spirit in Israel, which culminated in the Bar Kokhba revolt 100 years later, leading to Israel's destruction. Bar Kokhba was an Antichrist in all senses of the term. He was hailed as Messiah. He was a false Christ. This is why I'm very wary of the people of God rising up and rebelling against the government. It leads to destruction. People don't realize that in Jewish history, an Antichrist isn't just an evil leader. The Antichrist promises freedom through force, and the people of God choose him over the real thing." This concludes today's lesson, part 1 of Revelation 13. Next time we will conclude the chapter and learn about the false prophet, enforced worship, and the death decree that is declared against those who refuse to accept the mark of the beast.